Now I'd love to hand over to Hannah Jo from KISS to give you a bit of an intro as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today again. My name is Hannah Jo, and alongside 9 other talented individuals, I'm leading the KIS Human Rights Initiative. And our goal here at the Human Rights Initiative, also known as CREE, is to foster a community of socially aware and empathetic global citizens who actively engage in current events and social issues in outside of the classroom. And we are known for organizing the annual Human Rights Week event that takes place in April, but this year and for all the other years to come, we truly wanted to expand beyond that. And we are so fortunate to have this briefing event with Human Rights Watch and to have it set the tone for the rest of the year for us. And I really look forward to the discussions we'll have today. And then I'll return the floor back to Stephanie, who is now going to play a video for us.
LGBT가 더럽다라고 말하는 거는 뭔가 동성애에 대한 그런 편견이 있는 거잖아요. 저희 한국 사회에서 만들어 놓은 어떤 프레임 같은 것 같아요.
퀴어 이슈 같은 게 전면화되면서 학생들에 의한 혐오 발언도 이제 제 생각에 더 많아진다고 생각하는데,
학교라는 곳이 청소년 LGBT들에게 우호적이지 않은 곳이라고 느꼈습니다. 사람들이 너무너무 모르잖아요. 특히 트랜스젠더에 대해서는 더더욱 모르는 것 같았어요. 매일매일 입는 옷, 그리고 또 매일매일 들리는 화장실, 탈의실 이런 것들이 항상 스트레스가 되고, 그래서 학교를 정말 가기 싫은 곳으로 만들었다고 생각을.
교사가서 얘기를 할 때 동성혼이 합법화되면 뭐 수간도 합법화돼야 되고 뭐 그 사람들이 뭐 얼마나 막 문란하고 음란하고 뭐 우리한테 안 좋은 영향을 끼치는지 막 이런 얘기를, 그 상황이 너무 싫은 거예요.
한 친구는 아우팅을 당했어요. 학교를 다닐 수가 없게 된 거예요. 심한 이지매를 당해가지고. 그래가지고 결국엔 자퇴를 하고 자기 갈 길을 갔죠.
어디 정신병원 이런 데 가둔다라는 식으로 어디 끌려가서 정말 뭐 전환치료라도 받는 게 아닌가, 이런 두려움이 엄청나게 컸었거든요. 그래서 말을 못 꺼냈어요.
구글에 쳐가지고 뭐 레즈비언 영어 문서로 이건 내가 꼭 봐야 되나 이런 생각이 많이 들었었어요. 제가 전도사가 됐었어요. 그래서 친구들한테 올바른 성교육을 시켜주고 알려주고 또 모르는 거에 질문하면 거기에 답해주고.
됐으면 좋겠다. 그런 학생들의 생각을 바꿀 수 있는 갖췄으면 좋겠다는 생각을 하고 있습니다.
정부에서는 차별금지법을 먼저 제정해주는 게 제일 좋을 것 같고, 그리고 학교에서는 그런 어떤 차별이 일어나거나 문제가 일어났을 때 적극적으로 다른 폭력 사태에 대비하듯이 그 적극적으로 좀 대응을 해줘야 된다고 생각을 하고,
교사들도 뭐 직원들도 이런 교육을 해서 인식을 바꾸고, 또 그리고 수업에서도 교육 내용에 성소수자 관련된 내용을 넣어서 어릴 때부터 포용할 수 있는 그런 교육이 진행이 되었으면 좋겠습니다.
편견이 많이 사라지는 걸 느껴왔었어요. 그래서 유튜브를 시작하게 됐습니다. 조금 더 많은 사람들에게 성소수자가 뭔가 무서운 존재가 아니고 좀 더 우리 일상에 널려있는 존재구나, 좀 편안하고 재밌는 존재구나.
처음 만난 썰입니다.
Okay, thank you so much for the video, Stephanie. I think we'll have now Ryan Thoreson and Carrie kind of share their findings and their experience with writing the report and what they've discovered so far.
Great, thank you. And wanted to say a special thanks to Hannah Jo for organizing things for today. It's really great to talk to you all about some of the research that we did for the report and some of the ideas that we got from students about ways to move LGBT equality forward in South Korea. So I've been a researcher at Human Rights Watch for the past 6 years, and a lot of my work has focused on the rights of LGBT kids in schools internationally. So back in 2015 and 2016, I traveled around the US and wrote a report based on interviews with LGBT kids in different states in the United States. After that, we did a report in the Philippines, looking at bullying and discrimination in the Philippines. And we've really thought about the LGBT youth work in terms of places where documentation and stories can really make a difference, where there are organized groups on the ground who are advocating for anti-discrimination protections and working to provide mental health support. But often those groups are really stretched and don't have the time or bandwidth to just go out and do interviews and kind of compile everything into a report. So, after discussions with groups in different countries, another researcher from Human Rights Watch did a report on the experiences of LGBT youth in Vietnam. And we met with some activists in South Korea and decided to do a project in South Korea as well. So around the time that we were starting the project, I was also working in the Human Rights Clinic at Yale Law School. And the clinic is a really unique opportunity for law students to engage in hands-on human rights lawyering, to do the kind of human rights research and advocacy that they would do as a human rights professional later in their careers. And so we had a great team of 4 students at the law school who worked on the project, 3 of whom, including Carrie, came with me to Korea and kind of led the initial interviews and wrote the first draft of the report as a collaboration between the Lowenstein Clinic at Yale Law School and Human Rights Watch. So why did we look at South Korea and what did we find? One of the reasons that we were really interested in looking at South Korea is because attitudes are changing so rapidly. There was a Gallup poll earlier this year that found that 81% of South Koreans think that it's unfair to fire someone because of their sexual orientation. There's other polls that show that, especially among young people, attitudes toward LGBT people are really rapidly shifting. There's a real kind of generational gap between older Koreans and younger Koreans. But at the same time, that hasn't been reflected yet in law and policy. We've seen real pushback around some of the pride parades and festivals in Korea, pushback against student rights ordinances that have been proposed in different parts of the country, and still the ongoing debate over a national anti-discrimination law. So we were interested in kind of talking to young people to get a sense of what the situation was like on the ground, and then to the extent that we could, sharing some of those stories in a report and in the multimedia video that you just watched. So what are the findings, or what did we learn from young people? We ended up talking to about 67 interviewees over the course of 2 trips and then some follow-up interviews to South Korea, 26 of whom were young people talking about their experiences in schools. And 5 main challenges kind of came out of those interviews. One of them was that LGBT students still experience a lot of bullying and harassment in schools, including things like ostracization, where they're maybe outed by their peers and then kind of excluded, verbal harassment and teasing, some incidents of cyberbullying, and then in some instances, physical and sexual assault. That was rarer in the interviews that we conducted, but it did come up in a couple of the interviews. And the verbal harassment in particular wasn't only at the hands of students. It was often at the hands of teachers who would make remarks in the classroom, either in a general sense or targeting one student and kind of picking on that student in front of their classmates. One of the stories that really stood out to me as we were doing the interviews was a young woman named Lee Boreum, who was a 21-year-old lesbian student, graduated, but talked about her time in high school when her peers learned that she was romantically interested in women. She was ostracized by her classmates who would leave her out of activities and kind of turn their backs on her, but also they would verbally harass her. She played a brass instrument and other students in school destroyed it. And as a result of this, she struggled with depression and insomnia and self-harm, and ultimately dropped out of school. And when we talked to her about why she didn't tell a teacher or why she didn't kind of seek help in her high school, she recounted an incident where other students in the class had been attacking LGBT people, and the teacher heard them but didn't step in and do anything. And she said, you know, I just didn't believe that teachers would be a resource for me if I came to them. And you know, I think that is very emblematic of a lot of the stories we heard, where it wasn't just the sense that students were bullied or were harassed by their peers, but also that they didn't know where to turn for support when they experienced bullying. So that was part of the second theme that we found in the report. When students do experience problems in schools, they often don't know where to turn. A lot of students worried that counselors would violate their privacy and would out them to their parents or teachers or other students, and then that would put them at risk of being bullied or rejected further. The third issue is that students who were struggling alone often struggled with mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and self-harm, and often found that mental health professionals inside and out of schools really weren't like trained or prepared to deal with those issues. So, you know, some of the students recounted calling the 1388 Youth Helpline and having counselors tell them that maybe it was a phase or maybe they should try not being gay, and that just making them feel more alone than before they called. A fourth theme that came out was rejection in school curricula. So a lot of students just didn't see themselves reflected in the lessons that they were learning at schools. A big piece of that was the National Sexuality Education curriculum, which doesn't talk about kind of keeping LGBT youth safe as they start to become sexually active. So a lot of students said, you know, I don't know that much about being LGBT. It's not something I feel like I can talk to my parents about. I don't feel like I can talk about it with my friends, and I'm not learning anything about it in school. So they would turn to the internet and, you know, weren't sure of the quality of the information that they were getting, and wanted to get more of that information in school. And then the last theme that came out was in interviews with a lot of transgender students who mentioned that the school environment was particularly difficult for them when they had to wear uniforms that were inconsistent with their gender identity, or didn't have access to bathrooms and locker rooms where they felt comfortable, changing rooms. And so schools that didn't kind of make accommodations or help those students feel comfortable were often very unwelcoming for transgender youth. And that was identified as a place where a lot of schools could be more proactive in making things more comfortable for students. So based on that, you know, we put together a list of recommendations that you can find at the end of the report for different parts of the government and different actors as to things that they can do to make schools more welcoming. And I'll just really quickly touch on 4 of those before I turn it over to Carrie. The first was that, you know, we do think that it's still really important for the National Assembly to enact a comprehensive anti-discrimination law. And that wouldn't only protect LGBT people, it would also go a long way in addressing discrimination against people with disabilities, racial minorities, older people, other groups who might face discrimination and currently don't have a strong legislative framework to protect them from being fired or evicted or discriminated against in school. The second thing that we identified was that the Ministry of Education could make some important inroads in schools by promoting LGBT inclusive messaging in the school curriculum, including the National Sexuality Education curriculum. You know, we want students to see themselves reflected in the school curriculum. We want them to, you know, read stories in English that reflect their that might kind of reflect their life experience or what their life experience might be. In literature classes, that's really important. In social studies, one of the things that often came up was that LGBT rights would be debated as a kind of controversial topic. And you know, that's one place to affirm that LGBT rights are human rights and that LGBT rights should be respected, instead of treating it as a kind of topic of debate that LGBT people should have the same rights as everyone else. There are good kind of policy guidelines in other parts of the world, and UNESCO and other organizations have some good guidelines as to how schools can do these kinds of things better. And so that was one area that we recommended to the Ministry of Education. The third thing is that the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, which often which handles a lot of the kind of counseling in Korea, could do a better job of training counselors to be prepared to talk with LGBT youth about the situations that they face, especially when LGBT kids don't have parents or family that they feel they can confide in. It's really important to have affirming messaging coming from adults and someone that you know you can talk to confidentially and share concerns and ask questions without worrying about that being exposed to parents or teachers or friends. And then the last thing is that there's a lot that schools can do at the kind of individual school level to make LGBT kids more safe. Anti-bullying policies and having clear policies against bullying on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. That's one major recommendation coming out of the report, but also little things to accommodate transgender students, giving people more uniform options so that people don't feel physically uncomfortable wearing a gendered uniform, making sure that students' names and pronouns are respected if those are not the same as their legal name or pronouns. Those are little things that individual schools can do to kind of make the school environment more welcoming. And we heard that a lot of teachers that we spoke with were reluctant to do things like that because they worried about parental backlash or the school kind of getting angry at them for putting up a pride flag or signaling some kind of support for LGBT students. And so we want to encourage schools to create more space for teachers and others to be supportive of students. In many countries, gay straight alliances or LGBT student groups are becoming much more common. And in many contexts, that's a really helpful way for kind of peer-to-peer learning and solidarity. So that's another thing that we've certainly kind of focused on as an option for schools to help students have a place where they'll feel comfortable and can talk about some of these issues among themselves. So that's a really quick overview of the report and its findings. I'm obviously totally happy to answer questions and looking forward to the discussion. But I wanted to turn it over to Carrie to hear a bit about the experience of interviewing and kind of how the research went.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie. I was a Yale Law Clinic student working with Ryan on this report. And now I currently work with asylum seekers on the US-Mexico border in Texas. And I'm in DC at our Capitol for work right now. So as your students, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what the experience was like as a law student myself and why I chose this project. So in our clinic, you get descriptions of the different human rights projects that you might be able to work on for that semester. And this project really stood out to me both because of the subject as well as the process that we were going to go through in terms of writing this report. So I had experience in suing the US government about rights issues in our school. And then at law school, my main focus was on migration and conflict. And so I knew about the discrimination against LGBT individuals in places like the Middle East and Malaysia, but the description really struck me because I was really surprised to read about the kind of discrimination that was taking place against LGBT students in Korea. So I really wanted to understand this kind of discrimination that to me seemed so different from what I'd studied, and yet also just incredibly harmful to students. I think the report really lays out how deeply damaging to LGBT students this sort of like day in, day out denial of their existence at school and the refusal of the government to step in and stop those harms really is. So writing the report from a process perspective really raised a series of complicated issues, and it made me very glad that I had Ryan as a teacher to help work through those. For me, like two of the most fundamental issues were just, one, who are we going to talk to? And two, how are we going to adequately represent the people who spoke to us for this report. So first, for me, I think one of the most basic challenges in human rights reporting is figuring out who you're going to talk to, since oftentimes you're in a different country, and this may be your first time, as it was for me, in a new country, and you're trying to figure out who you're going to be speaking to. So for us, we really wanted to understand what was happening to LGBT students in Korea, but none of us were Korean, and none of us knew even what it looked like to have a day in the life of a Korean student. So for example, one of the things that really surprised me was I was used to school ending at 4 p.m. and then I learned what a cram school was, and I was shocked because it sounded like about the same amount of work that I took on as a law student, and certainly not the amount of studying that I did as a high school student. And so then we also had to learn the perspectives of not just students and what their day in, day out life was, but the perspectives of the people who were either going to support them or who were going to be harmful to them. So that meant that we needed to talk to parents, to teachers, to schools, to government officials, to nonprofits, and just many more different kinds of people who were going to have an influence on what a student's day-to-day life was going to look like. And then the last part of that was after we'd found those different groups of people, we also had to find people who were willing to speak to us. And some of that meant learning Kakao Talk and trying to communicate via Kakao Talk. And some of that meant trying to write very formal interviews when none of us really spoke Korean, let alone formal Korean, to government officials. And so that process, even in and of itself, was just a very complicated and interesting process to walk through of who were we actually going to speak to once we arrived in Korea. Then the second issue was one of representation. There's an incredibly limited amount of time for interviewing, but then that report has to actually represent the voices of the people who were so brave to come forward to speak to us about some of these worst moments of their life. So we were having to be very thoughtful about how, especially as non-Koreans, we were conducting this research, we were doing these interviews, and the way in which we were writing about these people's experiences. So it can be really, really easy to write about people's experiences in a way that actually is very harmful. And our team had to spend a lot of time talking with each other, as well as other experts and people in country, about how exactly we were doing that writing. So it's probably still not perfect. If you read the report, I'm sure you might have things that you would have added or changed. But our goal was to try to capture the sort of decades of really, really incredible work that LGBT activists and students in Korea have already devoted to fighting for their rights. So as a student, I sort of had two main takeaways that I wanted to share with y'all. One was, it was just really inspiring to see all of the work that LGBT activists and students are doing in Korea. I learned so much from the students who were fighting for their rights and for their future. And that was an especially sharp contrast to what I learned from the government and schools, who seemed very much lost about what to do for students. And I think one sort of experience that I wanted to share was, we did an interview with Zingdong. And that is a nonprofit organization that works as sort of a crisis support system for LGBT youth. In our interview with them, they were talking about just really tremendous numbers of students who were coming to them for mental health counseling, who were coming to what in the interview seemed like a very small space, and yet clearly they were supporting a really incredible number of students who needed to have a place to stay after having had trouble at home, who needed food, who needed support. And seeing the fact that so much of supporting the future was sort of falling on the shoulders of a nonprofit really was striking, because to me, in going through the interview, it just kept feeling like this was something that was very clearly support that the government should be giving to students. And while it was incredible that they had stepped up to the plate and were doing it themselves, it was just so clear that more funding, more attention, and more support would have made all the difference for that many more students. The second takeaway for me was that the interview process was both really difficult and then also really moving. So we started interviewing people first thing in the morning. We didn't finish till late. And then through that process, what really struck me was that if you hear one story, it really is moving. But then we were just hearing stories nonstop of people who had very similar experiences in school and who were really, that to me really emphasized just how many people were being hurt every day by the government's failure to take just very basic steps to enforce the rights of students in schools. And that for me as a student myself, you know, who was in school, just really struck home how much more could be done at a very, very fundamental level to make a big difference in students' lives. And I'm going to turn it back over after those comments for what I think will now be Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie. I think we'll have the Q&A a bit later. For now, I think we can break out into small discussion groups. And so we'll have that for a few minutes and then we'll return back as a large group and have a Q&A in the form of like a Menti